Anyway, welcome. It's really exciting to get this new exhibit on educating people about the historical history of the judges in justice in Contra Costa County. I think it's really important to, for people to be educated on this subject, and that's why sort of push to get it done, and I'm very happy to have it done. By the way, my name is Priscilla, and I'm the director here. And I'm going to introduce Donald Baston, who he and his wife were the ones that put together the exhibit with Judge Goode's help. And then Judge Goode is going to speak, Justice Marchiano is going to speak, and Judge Flier is going to speak. And we have possibly one more from San Ramon who's out there trying to find parking who will talk. So they'll be brief but interesting, I think. So, Donald.
Thank you all for coming. Again, my name is Donald Bass, and I'm on the board here. And my wife and I put together this exhibit. I wanted to introduce my wife, Clementina.
Yes.
Together we make one reasonably good exhibit curator. She's responsible for the look of our exhibits. Her background is in fashion design and pattern making. So she has a very well-developed sense of color and space and proportion and that sort of thing. So if you like the way it looks,
we like the way she looks.
And if we don't like it, we blame you.
This all came about as a result of a donation brought to us by Judge Goode from the Superior Court of artifacts and documents that belonged or were associated with the late Richard Arneson, who was a judge in Contra Costa County for 49 years. Longer, certainly, than any judge in the county, possibly longer than any judge in the state. These consisted of some personal artifacts, books, but primarily the documents have to do with probably the most famous trial that he was involved in, and that's the Angela Davis trial in 1971-1972. He was the presiding judge in that trial. We have now basically a fairly complete transcript of the entire trial. And for anyone who's doing research on legal, social, political history in the late 20th century, these are invaluable documents. I'm only aware of one other organization that has anything comparable, and that's the Michael John Institute in Berkeley. We're very honored to have these documents, and thank Judge Goode very much for bringing them to us, and for all the help he was in putting together this exhibit. This exhibit naturally concerns something about Judge Arneson, also something about the Angela Davis trial. We wanted to expand it to include the history of the legal system in the county. One thing we learned right away is that we didn't know anything, and most of the people we talked to didn't know anything about the legal system in this county and its history. So we thought that since we are the holder of so many legal documents, that would be something that would be useful. So we learned a lot in putting this together about the history of the county. Basically, it breaks down into 4 different periods. The early period when California became a state, the justice system that was set up then, the Constitution of 1880, which established the Superior Court. We're still working with the Constitution of 1880. It's been amended hundreds of times, but it's still basically the Constitution that we're working with. And then finally to the creation of the municipal courts, and then finally what we have today, which is the Superior Court. I mean, it's the only court that's left in the county. One thing that kind of leaped out at us right away is the composition of the court, and that's something we kind of spent some time with. As one might expect, for most of its history, the judges in the county were men, and they were white men. It's only been fairly recently that we begin to see some diversity in the court. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, we begin to see some women, and today there are more women on the court than there are men. So there's been a substantial change in just the makeup of the court. We do see certainly a lot of changes in the diversity, ethnic diversity in the court too. I don't want to take up any more of your time. We have a number of speakers here. Again, I want to thank Judge Goode and ask Judge Goode to come up and say a few words.
I wanted to thank Donald and Clem, who have put an enormous amount of time into this. It's been a very interesting experience for me. What happened is, many years ago, the Contra Costa County Historical Society was made the official archivist of the Superior Court in Contra Costa County. And when Judge Arneson left, he left behind a large volume of material, and among the other things I was doing at the time was I was presiding judge, and I am the chair of the court's History and Artifacts Committee. I noticed by looking on the wall that some of our current judges are now history, and I'm looking forward to telling them that they are in a museum. They're going to enjoy that. But we wanted to find a good, secure home for Judge Arneson's papers, because he truly is a legend in the law. This is a man who served 49 years in this state, and as Donald said, I don't know of any judge who served longer than that. And not only did he serve a long time, but he served with enormous distinction. Dick was just an encyclopedia of criminal law and procedure, and people who had, judges who had questions about what to do in a difficult case would go to talk to Dick and ask Dick's advice, and he always had things just off the top of his head. You know, he could cite you cases and history off the top of his head, and he was just a real resource. And it's when the inevitable came, it still was just a great loss that we lost him. But it's a real privilege that his material is here now and is so well taken care of. And Justice Marchiano was telling me that he actually was able to work through the material and help to organize it so it's in a little bit better shape than it was when it was left, and that's going to be helpful to researchers in the future. But we managed to capture a fair amount of material that will be helpful to anybody who someday is looking into Judge Arneson's career, which is very, very important. And I have to say that Donald was very challenging. I would get these emails once or twice a week asking me about how the court started in 1920. What was this justice court thing? What were justices? He knows far more about this than I do. And I'm really looking forward. And I'm something of a historian myself. I mean, that's kind of my hobby. But what's up on the walls there is going to be really worth preserving, because even as we speak, the Chief Justice has commissioned a commission on the future of the courts, and there are judges and justices who are working very, very hard now, chaired by Supreme Court Justice Carolyn Corrigan, to envision 21st century courts and what do the courts look like in the next iteration. So when we think of the judicial branch, we tend to think of something a little bit stodgy and doesn't change very much, but it's actually not without a little bit of dynamism as we enter the age in which everything is going to be kept digitally. In my court, for example, right now, all of my files are e-files, which it's not true court-wide, but mine are all e-files, which is a real challenge to historians in terms of figuring out how you preserve that and how we deal with that. But this commission on the future of the California courts is going to turn the wheel again. So it's really just wonderful that we've been able to preserve this history. So thank you very much for all the hard work you did. So one of the little pieces of history that's on the wall there is the plaque from Justice Marchiano. Justice Marchiano served with great distinction in our court for 10 years, I think it was, before being elevated to the Court of Appeal, where he served for another 15. So that's a quarter of a century that Jim served our county and our state with enormous distinction, and we're really privileged. He also is one of the court's historians, and he prods me with things from time to time, and has been a great help here as well. So Jim was going to say a few words.
First of all, it's nice to look around the room and see people from the past that should not be forgotten. Josh Genzer's here. His father was a Superior Court judge. I see the Brays are represented. Chris Bowen is back there, who's a currently serving judge. What I wanted to do was, first of all, thank you for the wonderful exhibits. My wife and I, when we travel, and we travel quite a bit now that I've retired, if we're in the United States, we always stop at courts, whether it's in New England, and so I have pictures of some of the famous old courts. When I went to Cuba, I made a point of going to the courts there that weren't serving the people very well. But in any event, I've seen a lot of exhibits. Yours is outstanding. For a historical museum in Contra Costa County of this size, with the finances that you have, the support, it really is a wonderful exhibit that you two have put together. Tremendous. I just wanted to spend a couple of moments trying to tie together the old history and the new history involving Judge Arneson, so that there's something appropriate said about him. When you ask Judge Arneson who was the judge that he modeled himself after, who was the judge that he felt was the one that had the characteristics and the work ethic that he modeled himself after, he would have said Homer Patterson. As far as the work ethic, no one had the same work ethic that Judge Arneson had, who would get to court at 6:15 in the morning every day of his life. And that was from his Icelandic background, growing up on a farm, working hard on a farm in the morning, and then going to school and working on the farm again. So and then when he was a lawyer in Antioch, working with the Italian agricultural community, the school community, he always met his clients at 7 o'clock in the morning. With the Italians, he would have a cup of coffee with grappa to start kick the day. And grappa in those days really was not the drink it is today. For one of his birthdays, Judge Swagger and I bought a bottle of grappa to give it to him. The bottle was $35 today. In those days, it was really just the residue of the Great Plain. But in any event, he would always talk about Judge Homer Patterson. When I was appointed in 1988, you usually give a few remarks at the induction service, and I found out that Judge Patterson was still alive. And Patterson was 95 years old at the time and living in a retirement home in San Pablo. So I called him up to get some history from him about some of the judges, and I had their names. And he was reaching back into the 1930s, and he was within a year or two of all of these judges, giving me some colorful history about them. And I thought this was fantastic, and I incorporated some of that in my remarks that day. Then 2 years later, I said, well, now he's 98 years old. We really should try to preserve this. And so with the help of the court, we recorded Judge Patterson. And the recording, I think, may be here. I think I did give it to the Historical Society. But in any event, in the course of this, he talked about growing up in the Midwest and then coming to Stanford, working in Richmond for Tinning and DeLapp, which was the premier firm in Contra Costa County at that time. Most of the heavy legal work was out of Richmond. That's where all the big companies were at the time, the shipyards, etc. Martinez and Concord and Walnut Creek were really just places of 1,500 people, 2,000 people. Anyway, at Tinning and DeLapp, he ended up marrying DeLapp's daughter, Octavia, and that gave him kind of an entree into the legal community. But this was during the Depression, and they did not have the business that Josh Genzer had when he was practicing in West County, at that time. And so they were allowed to serve as deputy district attorneys. And so they would have a dual practice. Have my own civil practice and build that up in the community, and then also had a criminal practice on the side, and that was allowed as long as you weren't in some type of conflict of interest. So he was prosecuting cases. So in the course of this conversation, Homer Patterson, whom Judge Arneson admired, I asked, what was one of your famous cases? And he said, well, that's easy. It was the Portuguese fisherman. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, back in the 1930s, as many of you know, Martinez was a place where the fishermen worked. The creek actually went all the way out to the bay, and they had canneries and places for the Italian and Portuguese fishermen to drop off their fish. If you walk in the marina area and you walk over the bridge there in the wetlands, you'll see some a brick sidewalk. There's old bricks, and that's where all of those canneries were at that time. So fishermen were here. Well, on one day, 2 Portuguese fishermen got into a fight, and the one knifed the guy to death and fled. And they assigned the case to Homer Patterson. And Patterson was working with the sheriff, Sheriff Veal, who's very famous. The Braves would know Sheriff Veal. And in any event, they couldn't find the defendant or this accused. And so they went to the post office over here and said, could you help us out? If you see any correspondence to his family members, let us know. And this was before the Fourth Amendment. This was before the map case, and before the Fourth Amendment was applied to the states in the 50s under the Warren Court. So in any event, one day the postmaster came running over to Judge Patterson, and he said, I think I've got something for you. And he had this envelope that was addressed to one of the family members of the person that had fled. So they held it up to this powerful light and began reading everything, located him in Sacramento. He talked about a hotel he was staying at to his relatives. And so with that, Patterson and Veal and a deputy sheriff got on the train, went up to Sacramento, arrested him, and brought him back. The family of the victim naturally was ecstatic that this happened, and so maybe we'll have justice. So the trial was held, and Patterson said it was hotly contested, reluctant witnesses because of the nature of the family involvement in those days and a fear of retribution. And the case ended up, instead of a second-degree murder or first-degree murder, there could have been a long punishment, it ended up with involuntary manslaughter and very short time in the county jail. So Patterson apologized to the family, said, I did the best I could, we found him, but unfortunately the jury decided it was involuntary manslaughter. As they walked out of court, one of the families of the victim, one of the members of the victim's family said to him, don't worry, we'll take care of it ourselves. I don't know if they did or didn't. In any event, Patterson had a distinguished career as a lawyer, was appointed to the bench in 1945, served from 1945 into the early 1960s. Judge Arneson came to Contra Costa County in the early 1950s, was in Antioch with the law firm there, but representing a lot of people in East County. Arneson gained notoriety because his habits never changed, and the same habits that he had right up to his death. He would read the law all the time. We get advance sheets with the most recent cases that have come down. Arneson would read those, earmark them, etc. So when he went to court, the judges were amazed in the 1960s that he was citing all these recent cases. And the older lawyers who would come up from Oakland or come up from West County and Richmond really were not as accomplished as he was. He appeared in front of Patterson many times, and Patterson liked his style and the fact that Arneson, in essence, would be doing Patterson's research for him because he'd be citing all the cases that Patterson perhaps should have known. So when there was an opening in 1963 and the governor called down asking local judges who would be a good candidate, to a person they all said, Richard Arneson from East County. He's the man that you want. And so he was appointed. He did serve then for a while, for a year or two with Judge Patterson. Patterson was very meticulous, and the practice of a judge in those days was different. There were only 3 departments, and the county was very small. And so the judges could work on a case one at a time. And Patterson liked to do this. He liked to get into the file, research the file, have it organized, and then have the parties come in, and they would call for the jury. So he was really on top of the case. Today, as you may know, the judges often get the case on the day of trial, and then have to master it after that. Or in Muni Court, they may have, or in the lower court in Walnut Creek or Richmond and out in Pittsburgh, they may have 2 or 3 files that they're looking at the same time. Well, Patterson liked doing it this way. The workload began to pick up. The PJ changed, and the PJ is in charge of assigning cases each Monday to the other judges. And so he said, you're going to have to pick up your pace. And he wanted to give Patterson more than one case at a time. And that's what he didn't want to do. He was meticulous. He wanted to spend time on the file. He wanted to be fair to everybody. And so then that caused him to retire. He simply didn't want to do that. And so he retired in the mid-1960s, lived to about 1989 or 1990 until he was 98 years old. Well, then when Judge Arneson took the bench, having argued cases in front of Patterson, he wanted to be meticulous in the same way, but Arneson's personality was totally different. Arneson wanted to milk more cows than anybody else on the farm, and this was true. He thrived on getting up early, having a heavy workload, but being fair in each of the cases. And it was this model of fairness from Patterson that he used in the Angela Davis trial. The Angela Davis trial started where the killing was in 1970, and Arneson had only been on the bench from 1963 to 1970. But he was well known because he kept up on the law, and he was teaching criminal law by this time with several colleagues, teaching to other judges as they were appointed to the bench. And so the Judicial Council and the Chief Justice, after a number of judges were disqualified, the case was in Marin County. It was a horrible killing, as you know, where Judge Haley, Jonathan Jackson, the young kid, came into court and had planned it. He'd come to court several days before to get away with, to see what he could get away with. And they had no security at all over Marin County. It's where the Frank Lloyd Wright courthouse is. Everything's open. Everything was around. Anyway, he came in during the summertime with a heavy coat on, and on trial was one of the Black Panthers, who was a friend of George Jackson. There's a whole gang of these people in prison. He was on trial, and they had brought in 2 witnesses. And these witnesses also from prison were supposed to testify. They probably would have refused, but he comes into court with the coat on. Under the coat are all these weapons, and takes over the court, gives the weapons to the 2 witnesses, and then they also get the defendant, and they took over the court and grabbed 2 female jurors, which is horrifying, got the judge and got the prosecutor, and they taped, when they got to their escape van, they taped the shotgun to Judge Haley's head, and they had guns pointed at the female jurors. And this is very, very scary stuff. Well, there's no way the San Quentin guards were going to let these people leave, and there's no way the sheriff was going to let them leave, and so there was a shootout there in the parking lot. And Haley was killed by the shotgun, as Gary Thomas, who was the prosecutor, who was in the van, said there was blood all over the place. Thomas got shot and ended up being partially paralyzed, but later became a judge, and a very effective judge over in Marin County. One of the jurors was shot, but she survived. But then all of the other people were killed. Jonathan Jackson, the defendant, the 2 witnesses from prison, they were all killed. So you had no witnesses about what had transpired. The people had been killed. They were able to tie some of this to Angela Davis, and an arrest warrant went out. Peter Smith signed it from Marin County, that she had been aiding and abetting. And under the law, an aider and abetter is as guilty, or can be as guilty, as the actual perpetrator. Well, she fled to New York, and they couldn't find her. And she was an avowed communist. There is no doubt about that. She had actually put out something favorable to the Russians going into either Czechoslovakia or Hungary. Remember when they had those uprisings at that time? Well, she wrote some stuff for them, and at one time Brezhnev gave her a medal for the work that she had done. And she hated the prison system, and she had been, as you know, she had been the sweetheart of George Jackson, Jonathan Jackson's brother. It was Jonathan that broke everybody out. And they had correspondence back and forth, passionate love letters and notes and stuff. And George Jackson was a leader of the gang in prison. He was a leader in the Soledad group that had caused problems in prison before. So they were looking for Angela Davis, and they finally got her in New York, brought her back, At that time, things were so tense in America. If you remember the Hoffman trial in Chicago, the seven there where they yelled at each other, and where Huey Newton defended himself, and they had to tape his mouth, and Hoffman didn't know how to control them, and the case eventually got reversed because the judge was an old-fashioned judge, was so tough on them, that, and it just went haywire. There were killings. I mean, the killings here in Berkeley, Oakland, New York, involving the Black Panthers. Our society was upside down. Kent State, the war in Vietnam. So some of the judges, after what happened to Haley here around us, Barry and Rick, they actually wanted to conduct trials in jail. It went that far, but the court intervened, the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, the Judicial Council. Wait a minute, there is a presumption of innocence, and we'll try to get around this, and that started the security. Well, after she was arrested, she had a wonderful defense team. The Communist Party, labor unions, leftist groups financed the case, financed everything they had, paid for these really good lawyers. So she wasn't undergunned at all. Leo Bransom, from an African-American lawyer from Los Angeles, was the lead lawyer. And believe me, he was better than Johnny Cochran or any of those people. Howard Moore, a very soft-spoken but very effective lawyer from Oakland, was first chair there in the case. In any event, they began disqualifying judges. And many of these judges didn't want to handle the case in any event. They ran out of peremptory challenges. You can challenge under 170.6 of the code. You can get rid of a judge for any reason at all. You don't really have to state a real reason. But they used up their challenges, and so then it was assigned to Arneson. And then it started. Arneson wanted to do this on time and do it fairly. He felt as if the case should be done fairly. It's an important case to the public. And the change of venue was granted, which made sense, but they went to Santa Clara County. The defense wanted to go to Alameda County, naturally. But it went to Santa Clara County, which was, this white middle-class county. It was not Silicon Valley at that time. And then there's a whole flurry of motions. And Arneson was trying to get the case going, but they kept peppering motion for this, motion for discovery. And finally the case got off the ground. And there was special security. It was filled every day with members of the press, filled every day with family members of Angela Davis. In fact, there was probably more people supporting her there than people involved in Judge Haley. I mean, he was a true victim, or Gary Thomas, or other people that were involved in the case. Anyway, one fact in the case, there's two things about it. Arneson had a very thorough jury questionnaire. And this was the beginning of this. If you go to if you're called for jury service today, and if it's a death penalty case, sexual assault case with any consequences or controversy or notoriety, you will have to fill out a questionnaire. And so you don't have to spend a lot of time answering all these questions in public. The lawyers have the questionnaire, the judge has a questionnaire, and then they can filter through it to get to the appropriate question. They had this exhaustive questionnaire, first of all, which Arneson allowed. And then the defense, and it's the first time in any major case, hired jury scientists, psychologists. They had 4 of them. And they were there and then the investigators investigated the background of all of these jurors. And you would have their name and address in those days. You could also find out if they signed any petitions for propositions and things. Now that's a public record. But they went further than that. And they dug into all of the background of all of these jurors and had the questionnaires. And the prosecution was doing the same thing. A very capable prosecutor, and I'll explain his theory in a moment. But they had jury selection. And the jury selection was remarkable. In a death penalty case, you get 20 challenges, peremptory challenges, without having to give any reason at all, 20 to both sides. And in most heavy murder trials that I did, or death penalty cases that I did, the attorneys would use 18, 19 challenges. Sometimes that's a mistake. It might have been smarter to cut it off earlier. Well, they had all this information, and after the 4th challenge, the defense passed. And it was remarkable. You need to pass in a case of this nature, but they felt, we know these people, and this is the jury that we want. And they were correct about that, as it all turned out. Then when the trial started, a new case had come down, People versus Ferretta. Under the Constitution, you have the absolute right to represent yourself if you are a defendant, if you're an accused person, as long as you're competent, as long as you don't even have to be college educated or high school educated. You don't have to have great capacity to speak. But as long as, and Flier knows from I remember a couple difficult ones that you had where the defendant represented himself. Judges don't like to have that happen. You give them a full admonition, telling them that you have a seasoned pros, a DA, you won't get any more privileges, trying to discourage it. But if they want to represent themselves, they can. Also at that time, some began representing themselves, and this doctrine of kind of advisory counsel came up, where sometimes the lawyer might be available to give advice to the person representing himself, or there was standby counsel. It was a different category. If the person acted up and really caused trouble in the courtroom, he would lose the privilege, or she would lose it, of representing himself or herself. Well, this was kind of blurred. And the two lawyers said, well, Angela Davis might want to be involved in this case and might want to represent herself at least for part of the case. And for good or for bad, Arneson granted that and allowed her, and this was the jury selection, and this was probably the change in what happened in that case, allowed her to give the her own opening statement. So the prosecutor stood up and outlined the case, and then she stood up to blunt it. And a very attractive woman, very articulate, explaining her relationship with George Jackson, trying to explain away certain things, and spoke for over an hour. But it gave the jury a chance to meet her and to size her up and to get information. So the case proceeded, and as you pointed out on, I think you did it in there, that on the newspaper clipping, on the prosecution side, it was a 13-week trial, went for days and days and many, many witnesses, because they had to tie together this case that she was involved with Jonathan Jackson. She had furnished the weapons, the one shotgun she had bought. It was sawed off the next day. She was seen renting a van the day before with Jonathan Jackson so he could drive over and size up what's happening in Marin County. So there's a lot of it. Then the big issue was the prosecution wanted to get in all the love letters, all the correspondence. The theory was she was doing this to get George Jackson out of prison, that they were going to, and he wanted to narrow it this way, but during the course of their trying to escape, they kept saying, we're revolutionaries. A photographer from the Marin Independent Journal opened the elevator door when these guys were coming down with the guns and all these victims that they had there, and they said to him, take our pictures. We are revolutionaries. We're going to get our people out of prison. So it was more of a general statement from them about the purpose of what they were doing. They didn't focus on George Jackson, but the prosecutor did. And they fought back and forth about these letters and stuff, and finally Arneson ruled that he would let in some of them, and just enough to give a flavor of the case, to show the relationship. And so those came in, and then the defense put on its case, and they decided that there wasn't enough evidence here. This was tenuous at best, and they decided not to put her on the stand. So she was never cross-examined, and even though you're told what is said in an opening statement is not evidence and cannot be considered as evidence, well, certainly you can't unring the bell after someone like Angela Davis, as powerful as she is, addresses you. So that was not forgotten. And so then after a number of days, it was not, I think it was 3 or 4 days, where the jury came back. At first they said, we think we're deadlocked. Then Arneson sent them back again, and then they came back, and as they read off the verdict, the courtroom erupted. And so Arneson stopped. He said, no, we're going to have law and order in here. We're going to have respect. And he ordered the bailiffs to remove anybody that caused any problems. And so they read off the various charges, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. And Angela Davis bursts into tears, hugs her lawyers, etc. And one of the jurors, somebody yelled out, power to the people. And Arneson said, no. And then Bramson stood up and said, well, we should be saying power to the judiciary, not to the people. And then with that, one of the jurors stood up and said power to the people, to show the type of jury they had. And afterwards, it turned out the forelady, who was a liberal, extremely liberal, and connected with Stanford, wrote a book about what had transpired. And she was friends with Bettina Aptaker. Bettina Aptaker was another leftist communist. Her father ran for president, ran to become president on the Communist Party. Well, they had the right jurors. But the trial did go smoothly, went on time. It didn't have the disruptions that that Hoffman trial or trials up and down the state were having because of the way Arneson handled it. And the lawyers respected him. And they did what he told them to do. And also, I think they felt, at least on the defense side, the case may be going kind of like we wanted it to go in any event. But this was typical of Judge Arneson, very careful, very meticulous. Some of his emotions are back there in the boxes where you can see where he wrote out exactly what he was going to do. And then when he put it on the record, he would write it out to make sure he didn't misspeak anything when he was there. He was a wonderful man. Modeled some of his life after Patterson. I don't want to take up any more of your time. I could go on and on with stories of cases that he had, and the contribution that he made to the bench, and the time he would spend with young judges, educating them on criminal law. But I thank you very much. Arneson was a very close friend of mine, and for you to have honored him this way, he would be very proud today. Thank you. My good friend Judge Rick Flier that served with me when we were on the bench together, and I think Rick has some interesting things to say. Go ahead.
Okay. Good. The one interesting thing I'd say is that it's very dangerous to be on a program after Marchiano, especially when one of his closest friends was Judge Arneson, and I know he's cut himself actually short. He had at least another 3 hours to talk about this topic. I wanted to talk more about the bench in general, and not to lose the fact that Dick Arneson was an exceptional jurist, President Speaker accepted. Our bench was composed and is composed of exceptional jurists. Something that when I'm talking with attorneys who are in Alameda County or San Francisco County or any of the Bay Area counties, they tell me their horror stories about what their judges are like, and I say, gosh, that never really even happened in Contra Costa County. And part of the thing that I would draw attention to, I happen to be one of those rare individuals, because Jim was talking about this period of transition. I arrived in Contra Costa County in 1973. I walked into the room you have for the judiciary next door. I knew most of those people. I appeared in court before most of those people. How many of us can ever say when we go into a museum that we've had direct personal contact with every one of the pictures that's there, with the exception of, I guess, Sheriff Veal, who was certainly gone by the time I got to Contra Costa County. But two of the primary people that I want to at least talk about as an introduction to this court were A.F. Bray and Wake Taylor. Those people, as far as I were concerned, I knew them personally, not A.F. Bray as much as I did Wake Taylor. A.F. Bray is an attorney in Contra Costa County, long before it was probably thought to be popular, was putting on radio shows about stories of Contra Costa County law. And I believe your Historical Society has some of those archived back in the stacks. Just amazing that a person, number one, who's an active lawyer would take the time to research these things and present them to people so they'd know about their history and know about what it means to be a Contra Costa. Wake Taylor, just a little bit about Wake Taylor. Wasn't from Contra Costa originally, was from someplace in the lumbering country up north. Was a Cal grad, was a Cal grad at the time when you may not realize it. We think now it's just sort of water off a duck, no pun intended, but the Stanford Acts was not always the trophy that was awarded between Cal and Stanford at the big game. It was an item that was originally stolen from Stanford by Cal at a baseball game, and it was the best 3 out of 5 games. And the Stanford people kept taking this axe during the innings and chopping this little blue and gold ribbon. You know, I think I'm from Cal, so it took at least 6 of them to lift up the axe and to do this thing. And at the end of the contest, the Cal not only took 5 games, I think they did it in 3 games, and the Cal rooters felt, well, hell, you know, they lost. We should get the trophy. So they wrestled the axe from the Stanford people, and they ran away with it. And I won't go into the whole story. They had to go to a butcher shop in Chinatown and hack off the handle because it had a 6-foot handle. They had to smuggle it back to Berkeley, and they knew, you know, there was no Bay Bridge back then. They couldn't go to the Berkeley ferry, so they convinced a co-ed that they knew to put the axe underneath her skirt, and they got on the Alameda ferry instead of the Berkeley ferry. And so all of this was going on back at the turn of the century, and the axe was sort of the topic of all these thefts and going back and forth. And ultimately, at the time when Wake Taylor was the student body president at Cal, the most horrible thing had happened. The axe was kept every year in a bank vault. And before the big game, it would be brought out and brought to the rally. There's an axe rally at Stanford and Cal before the big game. And these 2 fellows, or actually 5 or 6 fellows, posing as press photographers as they're carrying the axe into the armored car to take it to Berkeley, said, hey, would you mind letting us get a picture of the axe? He says, oh, sure, you know, this is 30s, what's going to happen? So they hold up the axe like this, and it turns out they had flash powder, among other things. They totally stunned the people who had the axe. They stole it and took it away. So Wakefield Taylor, the student body president, contacted President Jordan at Stanford and said, listen, you know, this is getting a little bit out of hand. Why don't we make this the trophy for the big game every year? And that's the way that happened. That's Wake Taylor who did that. So you can think of some of the things that these people were involved in. Wake Taylor, when he was on the DCA in San Francisco, that's the District Court of Appeals in San Francisco, California once again faced a crisis. One of our Supreme Court justices was incompetent. Not only incontinent, but incompetent. And this is Justice McComb. Wake Taylor was the one who set up the commission, who established a way at that time to somehow disenfranchise, if you will, Justice McComb. He wasn't going to retire. He was not serving as a justice should on the DCA, and actually Supreme Court at this time. So Wake Taylor was the one who managed to put that together and do these sort of things. When I came to Contra Costa, as I indicated, most of the people you have pictured there were either attorneys with me or who were judges, and it was a magnificent bench. It still is, but I mean, for a young attorney going into Dick Arneson's court, going into to Bill Channel's court or Max Wilcox, it was everyone's idea of what justice should be. Homer Patterson, I did meet. One of Homer Patterson's characteristics, which I learned from people who appeared in front of him, I think Bill O'Malley told me this, is that Homer Patterson did not have a voice like mine or like Jim or like Barry. He spoke in a whisper. He spoke in a whisper. And he was in the main courtroom there, the big courtroom. You'd be amazed how much you can hear when you're forced to listen to a person whispering. And he just maintained the decorum of his court by doing those sorts of things. Some of the things that I think are important is that all of us who were practicing attorneys in Contra Costa who appeared before those judges, just as Arneson was probably impressed by Patterson, I think it was impossible to be a practicing attorney in the 70s through the mid 80s when I was a practicing attorney to not be totally in awe of the justice system that existed in that time and still exists to this day. Having those sorts of people who you're appearing in front of, and just understanding this is really the way law is supposed to be. This is the way a court's supposed to be run, and other things of that sort. And the sort of corollary that I'd say, we had some amazing, if not curious, municipal court judges at the same time. And when I saw the picture of Betsy Ron there, who was, of course, a justice of the peace who then became a municipal court judge in Walnut Creek, when I first appeared in Contra Costa, and I was watching a hearing go on by a person in the DA's office. I was the DA at that time, and they're putting on a preliminary hearing, and I'm just sitting in her courtroom watching this hearing. First time I've ever seen a hearing of this sort. And Betsy Ron was a little bit finicky sometimes, and I'm sitting in the first row, and I'm way over on the left, and she points to an attorney on the right and says, "Are you chewing gum?" And the fellow says, "Well, yes, Judge." He says, "There's no gum allowed in my courtroom." He says, "Well, I didn't know that, Judge." And he goes like this to take it out. He says, "Wait a second, you can't do that." She takes her yellow pad, and she rips off a piece of paper, and she has her bailiff take it over to the poor fellow. And he sort of wraps it up like this, and he's looking at her eyes, "Give it to me!" And they give it to her, and he throws it. So watching all this, as a young attorney, I'm going, my gum, which is currently in my mouth, ends up very quickly in my stomach. And I understood certain things about Betsy that I didn't understand from the judges that I'd seen in Martinez. The other thing, when I started trying cases, of course, in Betsy's department, which was when you're a DA, it's you see one, you do one. So it was the next week that I was trying cases there, and learned fairly soon that it was important for you to end your case by Thursday afternoon at 3, because unbeknownst to the world, other than attorneys who practice there, Betsy had a hair appointment at 3:30, and you'd be putting on evidence, and suddenly all of the objections posed by the opposing attorney were being sustained. Not a good thing when you're trying to put on evidence. So that was one of the other rules. Just like the rule in San Pablo when I was in the municipal court there was you never put on an important witness between 1:30 and 1:45, because the police department in San Pablo is located right next to the court in San Pablo. And they would typically run the sirens. The officers who were coming on duty would run the sirens between 1:30 and 1:45. If you had anything important, it was going to be lost in these police officers putting on the sirens. Some of the other things that I would tell you, just in an overview of things, it was a bench when you were an attorney in the county. You sincerely appreciated the work of these very good jurists. Because you felt that regardless of what was being presented, you would get fair treatment there. And you'd get a fair decision made based upon the evidence that was presented. You wouldn't necessarily always win. As a matter of fact, you'd probably lose more than you'd win in many occasions. But it was going to be a fair treatment. And that sort of philosophy that I think was developed by A.F. Bray and certainly Wake Taylor and the others, the Pattersons who came before, were part and parcel of what really made our judiciary in this county not just unique, but great. Arneson was certainly one of the noteworthy members of that fraternity, if you will, and I'm not sure now that we have women judges, I call it siblinghood, but I'm sure that's wrong for English majors. But it was part of the entire spirit of the bench, which I find very blessed to practice law in this county, and then had the awesome honor of being part of that group of fellow judges. When you first get sworn in, and I was sworn in by Wake Taylor at the time, I'm looking at the 14 other judges who were going to be on the bench with me, because Superior Court was 15 judges at that time. And I'm looking up there and I'm going, holy mackerel, what did I get myself into? How am I ever going to relate, compare, work up to the standard of these fine jurists on the bench? And what I can say is that you get the support of each of those people, and it really is amazing. I'm not sure if I ever was at their level, but they really make you play your best game. Just as a concluding thing, thank you all very much for letting the three of us come and at least spout a little bit about the judiciary in Contra Costa County. Certainly Dick Arneson specifically, but not to lose sight of the fact that that display in there deals with the entire judiciary of our county and the history of that judiciary. The two stories that I told you are not even the tip of the iceberg of things that happen on a daily basis. I am a docent and take fifth graders around to the courts occasionally and tell them the many stories that happen to the extent that I can. One story I'll just leave you with, because my clerk related this to me, that at the time, is you may not know, the current Wakefield Taylor building has actually gained a story since its first construction. So the fourth story is something that didn't exist at one time. We used to just have a skylight at the top on the roof. And it used to be the practice of practicing attorneys during that time to get their jury out, and they'd go down to Department 1. Why Department 1, I'm not sure, other than the fact that Department 1 had a fully stocked bar. And they'd get their drink, and then they'd proceed up to the roof, and they'd go and listen in on the skylight as to what the juries were now deliberating, because that's where the jury deliberation room was. And the one story that I'll leave you with that deals with two attorneys who are in this situation, and they're going up listening to what's going on, and they maybe didn't have one toddy. By the time they were up there, they had 3 or 4 toddies, and they were feeling no pain probably at that time, and they kept leaning in trying to figure out what was going on in the jury room, and one of them slipped and fell through the skylight, which usually means that the trial is over. And for some reason or other, shortly after that, we developed a fourth story, and the jury room that used to be there on the top of the building became part of the DA's office when the DA's office was there. And the one personal story that I can tell you is I was once assigned to that area where the jury used to be, and typical, I'm not sure what would be the situation in California nowadays, but they had a bathroom for men and they had a bathroom for women there, and that was pretty neat for me because my desk was right outside the bathroom. So the first time that I'm now practicing in this sanctified place where juries used to deliberate in Contra Costa County, I go into one of the bathrooms to use the facility, and I'm turning around, and unbeknownst to me, that was also the place where the DA's office would store its stuff, and they had a full body female mannequin that was sort of behind the door, so I really couldn't see it going in. And when I'm going to use the mirror, I see this woman looking at me. So the only reason I'm saying that there is sort of like the TV show that used to be on There Are Many Stories in the Naked City. There are many stories that arise out of that courtroom. There are many stories that are just fond memories of everyone that you've displayed on the walls, that are worthy of your work and your investigation, that really make up the muscle and sinew of our judiciary. So thank you very much for the work you do and for allowing us to be here today.
Thank you very much, you guys. It's really wonderful. I learned so much. Beverly has a presentation. We're going to go a little bit further back in history, to say a little bit about the Justice of the Peace, Beverly Lane. And then, then Steve wants to say a couple of words, and we'll eat and be merry in the exhibit room.
Good.
Well, thank you. I wish my friend Chuck Ferreira had been able to be here and tell this story. But I'm a historian in the San Ramon Valley, and Chuck told me that he and his family lived in downtown Danville at a time when the valley was about 2,500 people, and Danville was the largest community. And his mother and grandmother had a beauty parlor that was about a block away from the Veterans Hall. Chuck was their only son, and evidently he was a fairly lively kid. And he said that one time he did something that he wouldn't tell me, and his mother said, "Chuck, I'm taking you to the Justice of the Peace." And so evidently he she marched him one block down to the Betts Hall, where the Justice of the Peace was sitting. And I think that, I don't know whether he was there once a month or once a week, but I think it was probably once a week. And everybody knew that he was there. And she marched Chuck in there and said, you know, that, and I don't know I can't remember who the justice was, Clark or somebody before that, and told the justice exactly what Chuck had been doing. And so the justice did what, of course, judges are expected to do. Talked to this sweet little boy with the best justice demeanor and straightened him out. And so Chuck later on grew up to be the superintendent of schools here in Martinez. And I think he probably could look back to that conversation with a judge that set him on the right path for the rest of his life. So thank you, judges.